And so, excuse me. But he says in this thing, at the end there, verse 13, as he's saying this, he says, after all that he has, he's second in command, all the power that he's given, all the prestige that he's given, this banquet that he's calling to, and the honor that he sees from that. Verse 13, he says, but all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting in the king's gate. Shadow missions lead to destruction. There's nothing about a shadow mission that keep us from being able to... they take away all the joy of anything that we can have when we experience God. Haman's shadow mission was self-idolatry, hatred, and cruelty. And it was that kind of thing that couldn't, he couldn't let loose of. He couldn't enjoy any of the stuff that he was around him because of that mission that was in his mind that he couldn't shake. And so the story goes in here then that as this has gone, as Esther's called this mission, he's eaten up by his own shadow mission. It says here that the king has a sleepless night, and the king can't sleep. And so, like all kings, he says, well, someone read me something. What do we got? He says, well, we got we got all the books that talk about your reign. Hey, yeah, let's read one of those. Why don't you read something about me? That would make me feel better. And so they decide, that's what we'll do. We'll read something about there. So they start reading about this. And then when they read this book, they come across the story of Mordecai foiling the plans of these kings to kill the king. And he realizes he never did anything to honor this guy for that. And so he was sick about it when he thought about what he was going to do. And so he says, who's around here for me to ask? Because this king can't make a single decision on his own. Oh, Haman's here. Hey, Haman, come on over here a minute. I got this situation. So he goes in there and he says, what do you suggest I do for a person to honor them? He says, verse 7, he says, early on in 6, he says, King David said, what should I be done to the man the king delights to honor? It says, now Haman thought to himself, this is kind of like in a little side, he's like, oh, he's talking about me here. Of course he is. He says, this is getting better and better. And so he comes up with a great idea. It says, verse 7, he says, for the man that the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, and one with a royal crest placed on his head, and put a crown on the horse, He says, then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. And then let them robe man and the king delight to honor. Lead him on this horse throughout the city streets, proclaiming before the king, this is what is done to the man the king delights to honor. And Haman can taste it. He's like, I can't wait. And then he says in verse 10, go at once, the king commands Haman, get the robe and the horse and do just as you suggested for Mordecai of the Jew, who sits on the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you've commanded. And in fact, he says, not only do this to Mordecai, which he can't stand, he says, but I want you to pull him around. I mean, does that not get sweet when you see how God works? And so he's, going around. He can tell him, he can imagine, he's just, oh, I can't stand this, Brings him all the way around. He runs and tells his wife how terrible of a day I've had. This is what I did say, but honey, don't worry about it. You got the banquet tonight. Oh, that's right. Because they've had a couple banquets now. So then in the story here, as it comes to an end, in chapter 7, finally they come back to the queen, and the king says, come on, queen, tell me what it is that you really want me to do. And then finally the queen comes out and says, I want you to spare my life. She confesses she's a Jew. And he says, there's this edict out there to be able to destroy all the Jews, which the king, his mission statement, or his shadow mission was to... He could have been a life of generosity, but instead it's self-indulgence, and that's all he cared about was himself. Wasn't even thinking about the things people were doing in his name. And he says that the edict's out there to be able to destroy, and he says, I'm asking, would you spare us? And he's thinking, okay, who would do this thing? And he says, it's this evil man, Haman, that did this. And it says in the passage here that the king was so enraged in 7 verse 10 that he says... he left. He had to leave the room. Verse 7, he says, the king got up in rage and left the wine and went into the garden. He had to think about this. He says, I'm so upset about this. Well, while that happens, Haman, to spare his life, throws himself on the queen, the legs of the queen, and he's reaching to her, to kiss her feet and says, please, tell him not to do anything, to spare us. King comes back in, and he says this, the king says and exclaims, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? He comes and says, Haman, what are you doing? Are you molesting my wife while I'm just out in his court? And so he's obviously furious. What am I going to do? And immediately at that, they cover Haman's head. And he said, well, Haman built these gallows over by his house. That's a perfect idea. Let's hang him from the gallows. Back in that day, it wasn't like the West. You hang him to kill him. You hung him so that people would see. So that was why it was built so high, so that people traveling through would see this person hung, and it would be a decree of this is what happens to people. And so Haman was hung for what he had done in this. And so we see in all of this, the mission does matter, because one sets us free and the other one destroys us. One gives us life to the full, and the other takes that life away, and we're never satisfied. And so I put in your thing, again from that book Ortberg, he describes some of these symptoms of a shadow mission in our action. Some of those things are chronic sense of soul dissatisfaction, emotional indicators, irritability, lack of joy, deep impatience, sense of smugness, exclusiveness, busyness on unimportant things. Our whole culture is under that one. Relationships that are superficial, self-indulgence and use of gifts, resources, lack of authenticity, running on empty, loss of excellence. These are not an exhaustive list, there's many others. But some of those are symptoms to be able to help you have indicators that, am I living a life and a mission that's more of my shadow mission than what God wants? Am I caught up in things of my own that is undermining the very life that God intended for me to be able to have and to live and to do, and a part of His mission? Every one of these symptoms that God has, He offers us counters to those solutions. Because if your life is full of busyness and unimportance, slow down. Create space within your life and margin. If you're running on empty, build Sabbath in your life so you can rest. If you lack a sense of a dissatisfaction of soul, create worship or come and place yourself in a worship. I was thinking about this morning as Sunday's about re-energizing ourselves. It's lifting up worship to God, but it's re-energizing ourselves for the mission of a week and a life. Because honestly, 6 days of a week, it's draining my soul. It can just drain my soul. And you come together and worship in community, and that's why we stress so much life groups. It's a way of re-energizing and helping bring us back to a place of where we're refreshed and renewed, and we're back on the mission of God. And so mission matters. The third thing, though, is realizing that God's purpose empowers you. Things changed, of course, in the story when Esther saw her mission. She was empowered. John Ortberg shares a story that he read about a mix-up at a doll factory. He said the voice boxes for Barbie and G.I. Joe accidentally got switched. He says you can imagine the shock in the boys when they'd pull the string of the G.I. Joe and they'd hear, "Let's shop till we drop." And he says for the girls, they were stunned to hear this, "Hit the ground now, hard, hard, hard." They were freaked out, obviously, because they didn't get what they thought. Well, King Xerxes thought he married a Barbie, but he ended up getting a G.I. Joe. He thought he would get someone who just would be complacent and fit in, and he ended up getting a woman who says, "Look, if I perish, I perish." And was willing to be bold for the cause of God and to be able to step out and do what God, even if it meant her own life. She realized God's purpose and plan in her life. And she realized the significance of what she was called to and the meaning that it had. And it was more than just a trophy wife. And from that moment on, she began to work and see God working in her life. It's like it opened up the awareness of what God was doing. She began to see that even in the midst of exile, God cares about His people, and He's still at work with His people. She saw the creativity, as I said, about in the midst of her plan of even bringing them together, not knowing what they'd respond to, that God creates puts a sleepless night on the king, and then has them pull together the books about Mordecai rescuing them, and the assassination plot, foiling the plot, the whole thing with Haman, all of it. He sees God working. And in the story, what's interesting, it starts with a banquet. And how the Jews are going to be killed. It ends with a banquet and the Jews celebrating their freedom. The Feast of Purim, which continues. Purim means, it's plural for dice, lots. And so the Jews celebrated that all through Jesus' day. It talks about the Feast of Purim, where they celebrate the freedom of the Jews from this edict, in the time of Esther. You saw a guy second in command who was Haman wearing the ring of the king, a shift to Mordecai, who was second in command. he was raised to second in command wearing the ring of the king. I mean, you just see God's working plan through all this all, and she saw that. She saw all that God began to be doing all around her, and what was working, what God was up to. It became evident to her in her life, and that's what empowered her to be bold in the things she was doing. So what is God's purpose for you and me? I mean, in the context of your life, what is God's purpose? Well, we use the mission statement. You've heard, I know Scott used it again, talked about it last week. It's to love God with all our heart, care for others as we would ourselves, and serve Christ in the world with passionate purpose. That's our purpose. That's our mission that God has called to. That's God's mission to this life. He's restoring lives and back to the way it was meant to be. Relationships, one by one, back the way it was meant to be. We're a part of that. We're to pursue that. He empowers us to be able to be about the mission of God. Our story becomes God's story as we become about what God is working. And then we can start to be able to see that. I listed here some empowering indicators, kind of where in your own life you help see that, how you're being empowered, what takes place in that. And one of them is that we maintain an attitude of selflessness. When we're, like in the case of, there's a shift in Esther from focused on herself to focused on God, and she became selfless, self-sacrificing. And it empowered her, freed her from not being concerned about my life. Can you imagine if we were freed from not being worried about my job or my finances or anything like that? Because you know what? God's in charge. And if he should have that, if I perish, I perish. It freed her in this selflessness that came. Another one is we adjust priorities to be available for God. Many of the shadow mission, indicators are things that are so consuming to us that we're misguided priorities. And when we free ourselves and we adjust our priorities to the things of God, it makes us available to him. And we start to see stuff. I mean, we become, I don't know if you've had that, but you become more aware because you've created space in your life. One of the biggest struggles we have is we don't have space. We stay connected with God through spiritual disciplines. In Esther, the first response was fasting and prayer, spending time with God, getting connected with him. And when we do that, God uses those disciplines to make us attentive to what he's doing. And then the last one is we let faith determine our actions. Her decisions now were based on faith, not about circumstances, not about odds, not about rules, not about any of that. It was obedience just as a response of faith. So where's God placed you right now? Is it in the role of motherhood as we're celebrating today? Is it a job or a leadership position that you're in? Is it with a friend who's facing a difficult time? Maybe it's a situation that you're in where you're called to speak up. Maybe you're in a situation where you don't even necessarily know it right now. You're kind of like Esther before the moment. You just really don't know it, but yet you got to believe God is in the middle of this. Know that wherever you are, it's no accident. God is at work. There's not a single time in our life, certainly as a believer, we can say that with confidence, that God is in the middle of where we're at, and God is at work. We might not see it right now, but God is at work. We might not understand, but we know that God does understand. And so in that moment, then the challenge then is to just allow God to reveal himself, to seek him out. Ask him to help you to resist, to expose the shadow missions in your life and to be able to resist those things that you tend to be drawn to so that you're available to do the work of God. Esther can't help us right now. We can learn from her, but she's not around to help us, but Jesus understands. Because he had his own shadow mission when you look at the story of Jesus. Throughout his ministry, when we look at his life, you can almost see it coming through when you think about him being temptation in the desert. Satan was doing these things where he would say, fall and someone will catch you. Eat, turn these stones into food and to feed you. It was, throughout, Satan was tempting him to find a way to carry out the mission of God in a much more comfortable way. Even to the point of the Garden of Gethsemane where he says to God, if there's any way this cup could pass from me. In other words, I'm into doing what you want, God, but I'd love to do it with less of a dramatic and sorrowful and suffering way. That was Jesus' shadow mission. But Jesus stayed true to God's mission and was obedient. But the point of that is that God, he knows what we go through. He knows our struggle.